If I could have your attention, we're going to get started here. The topic of discussion for our second panel is the democratization of American Christianity. And we have an esteemed group of panelists. To my right, we have Dr. Nathan Hatch. He is the President Emeritus of Wake Forest University and a former Dean and Provost at the University of Notre Dame, where he taught history. His 1989 book, The Democratization of American Christianity, published by Yale University Press, won 3 very prestigious awards, and also Professor Gordon Wood, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, called it, quote, the best book on religion in the early republic that has ever been written. We are joined next by Dr. Rusty Reno. Rusty is an American theologian and the editor of First Things magazine. He was formerly a professor at Creighton University, and his most recent book is Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. After Rusty, we have another friend, Dr. Josh Mitchell, professor of political theory at Georgetown University. He's also been the chairman of the government department and associate dean of faculty affairs. From 2008 to 10, he took leave from Georgetown, and he was the chancellor of the American University of Iraq, Soleimani. He is the author of Tocqueville in Arabia and America Awakening, Identity Politics, and Other Afflictions of Our Time. So to begin the panel, I want to go to Nathan Hatch's book and to the thesis. So this book is it was actually recommended to me by my wife. I started reading it a couple years ago, and it totally blew my mind, right? This was published 35 years ago. It shocked me in many ways, which we'll discuss today. But specifically, he begins by talking about how the pre-revolutionary Christianity, what preceded 1776, the Christianity of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, was very different from the Christianity which followed from 1776 to 1845. So during this period in the early republic, the population of the United States 10x's. So it goes from about 2.5 million to 20 million. And also the number of ministers 20x's. So it goes from about 1,800 to 40,000. And Christianity truly becomes a mass enterprise that impacts religion as well as politics and really sets the entire trajectory of the United States. I want to read just a very brief paragraph to kind of give you a feel for Nathan Hatch's argument here. He writes, "No less than Tom Paine or Thomas Jefferson, populist Christians of the early republic sought to start the world over again by raising the standard of, quote, no creed but the Bible, end quote. Christians in America were the foremost proponents of individualism, even as they expected the open Bible to replace an age of sectarian rivalry with one of primitive harmony. Like the egalitarian credo of the early republic, this vision has taken a powerful hold on the American imagination, despite the disparity between the quest for unity and actual religious fragmentation and even authoritarianism." So with that, I'm going to give Dr. Hatch a moment to kind of lay out the core argument of his book, and then our panelists will respond, and then we can talk about some of its implications for today. Dr.
Great.
Hatch.
Thank you, Johnny. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you for your attention. The first thing I'll say, and mostly for you students, is I backed into this project. I had taught history for 2 years at Notre Dame. I had written a book about politics and religion in the Revolutionary era among New England clergy. And I won an award to go to the Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard to study New England Federalists, really high culture. And so it was wonderful to have freedom to study. And so as I started reading, particularly there was a diary of a wonderful New England minister in Salem, Massachusetts, named William Bentley. He wrote a day-by-day diary. And early in the 19th century, what he kept coming up with was how populist religious figures were coming to Salem. He said that the Free Will Baptists had 2,000 people at a meeting. He said blacks were preaching, women were preaching. There was this kind of ferment. And so my focus changed to look at some of these populist preachers. And what I found is there was a whole upsurge. It was common people who sort of in the name of democracy sort of said, we need to rethink the church. And so that led to a long study. The whole book studies a variety of movements: Methodists, Baptists, Christians, Shakers, disciples, and even studies the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in some ways, Joseph Smith, who was a virtually illiterate religious genius, the early Latter-day Saints, they had a profound revolt against elite religion. And the Book of Mormon, for instance, the longest chapter it quotes from the book of Isaiah is prophetic protests against the elite. And so what I came to was an overall sense that in the early republic, there is a surge of populist religion. Common people take religion into their own hands. And in this sense, it became something very different from what you have in Europe, where you have churches and you have sects, small isolated groups. In this country, you get a religious market in which common people take religion into their own hands, and they transform the communication system. Their preaching is different, their singing is different, their print is different. It's at a time when there's a revolution in print. Print is cheap, and so many of these religious figures just write what they believe, and so you can come to terms with it. So there's a tremendous surge in popular religion. It's vernacular. They use humor, attack, repartee, mocking. Let me read you one interesting quote. This is a congregational minister who saw this kind of turmoil, and he goes after someone named Elias Smith, and he says, "Ridicule, sneer, malignant sarcasm, and reproach are the armor on which he goes. On this ground, and not on sober argumentation, he knows the success of his cause. If he knows the doctrine of original sin is not true, let him sit down and write a manly and candid answer to President Edwards' great work," Jonathan Edwards, "were he a dignified, candid, and intelligent controversialist, there would be enough to answer him. But who would wish to attack a windmill? Who can refute a sneer?" And thus you see this sort of populist communication. It has wide appeal, and it absolutely befuddles the elites, the Harvard and educated people who do not understand this new form of communication. Now, my argument is that this becomes a very deep strain in American history. It springs from a deep crisis of authority, where common people no longer accept the authority of elites. It's based on strong leaders who are self-ordained. That is, they are effective because they are persuasive. There's this whole new communication system of speech, print, and even singing. And let me say, I use the title democratization. It does not mean that these movements were necessarily democratic. They're populist, and often the results turned out to be more autocratic than what was before. But I do see this. It's interesting if you compare Europe and the United States. In the United States, the further down you go in the social order, the more religious it is. I think a main reason for that is you have religion in sort of populist terms. So Peter Berger once said, if India is the most religious country, Sweden the most secular, America is a country of Indians governed by Swedes. And so you do have this popular. Other professions in America, particularly law, medicine, were able to monopolize, were able to control. That has never been true with religion. You do have elite religion, but then you also have this pulsating popular religion. The final thing I'll say is, how does this, what relevance for today? And the kind of populism we see today, I think, has much the same spirit. It uses different kind of communication. It befuddles the elite. And I think many evangelical groups are used to populist vernacular communication, and thus they have affinity with political populism. I think evangelical groups are particularly susceptible to this kind of communication because it's deep within their DNA. And similarly, I think what happened in the early republic sprang from a deep crisis of authority, and I think that is also true today, where common folk see their core values challenged. What's the meaning of America? What's the meaning of marriage? What's the meaning of faith? When that's challenged, then they're open to new and populist forms of communication. So,
yeah,
great.
Absolutely fascinating. I should say we also have a spectrum of kind of low church to high church on the panel, from evangelical to Anglican to Catholic to Eastern Orthodox. Just as I'm listening to you, I'm internally conflicted, which is why we're doing this panel. I'm internally conflicted because I like a dose of populism in my politics, but I don't really like populism in my religion, and so maybe I'm just a walking contradiction. I want to go to Josh real quick before going to Rusty. So Josh, you're an Alexis de Tocqueville scholar. He had some interesting observations of his experience of religion when he visited America in the 1830s. So feel free to both respond to Dr. Hatch, but also maybe work in some Tocqueville.
Sure.
It's irresistible, isn't it?
It is. But I'll start out with the Greeks. The great Greek invention is on the one hand, on the other hand. And so my remarks are going to be on the other hand kind of remarks. First, I'm a social scientist, but also Christian. And that's actually a problem, and let me explain why. In the social sciences, those of us who do political and social theory, we're dealing with authors who demarcate the world in certain sorts of ways. So Rousseau, ancient modern, Tocqueville, aristocratic age, democratic age. And then, of course, we're using terms like democratization, postmodern. We often will use the term postmodern Christianity. But Christianly speaking, none of these work. None of these are relevant. The only relevant point is there's pre-incarnation and post-incarnation. So I'm always a little nervous about invoking these terms that come really from the modern period, including democratization, populism, when we're trying to understand something that comes way before it and whose historical categories don't in any way include it. It is a profound tension, and we need to always be thinking about it. So that said, now, with that caution in mind, let me just say some things about Tocqueville, who does show up during the Second Great Awakening. And his distinction, as you know, is that we are moving from the aristocratic age to the democratic age. And we have to ask the question, what really does that mean? Because we throw this word around recklessly, democracy, democratization. And Tocqueville, I think, like Plato and other great authors, knows that it's deeper than the political arrangements you have. And you tell me if this doesn't strike a chord in all of us. He thought that the big transformation occurred along three axes. And it led to us feeling utterly alone and delinked. First axis, nature. We no longer sense that we are in communion with nature. With the Greeks, you had some understanding that there was this connection between nature, logos and physis. With Darwin, Galileo, and the rest, all of a sudden we're in a cold, dark universe. And so we lose our connection with nature. Second axis, we lose our connection from generation to generation. He worries that the democratic soul will collapse in its temporal horizon to the instantaneous now and not think about our great-grandparents and our great-grandchildren. So time collapses into the instantaneous moment. And then it collapses socially in that we're no longer connected through roles and obligations, but through choices and negotiations. We move from being roles to independent persons. And what Tocqueville thought this all of this amounted to was we're moving from a world of mediation to a world of unmediation, a world of direct experience. As Nathan said, the full implication of this is that we completely derogate human authority. So my question, though, is populism really a helpful term here? Tocqueville he's there at the time that populism, that we call the first populist revolt, but he never uses the term. He's always asking the question, what's the deepest psychological phenomena at hand? And the reason why I think that's important is that we have to pay attention to the extent to which those three axes have come apart for all of us. And the question is, how do we put the world back together again? And it's not clear to me that you can put the world back together again institutionally unless you've addressed these deep psychological problems. So I don't want to focus so much on the institutional changes, the changes in the structure of the church, who's in authority, but on the human experience that invites the kinds of institutional changes that we see around us. And then the second point is like unto it. I think that that our problem, while we want to say, well, maybe we can use populism as a leverage here, I think our problem is a little bit different. And as I've said in the last several years, I think our problem is that we're not recognizing that there's three different economies. I'll say conservatives are not recognizing there's three different economies. Conservatives recognize two economies. They recognize the economy of debt, so we're really good on markets. We recognize the economy of the debt we owe to our fathers, and so we're really good on tradition. But what I'm saying is there's a third economy, which inheres in Christianity, and identity politics has appropriated it. It's a kind of spiritual economy of debt. The form that it shows up as today is, if you're this particular identity, you have a debt you can never repay. That's a variant of original sin in Christianity. And the left is working along the lines of this third economy of spiritual debt. Even the green energy push away from dirty fossil fuels toward clean energy. It's a push toward an economy of purity and stain. And I worry that conservatives have no way of addressing this. So my argument here is that our crisis really can't be solved and addressed along the axis of the democratization of Christianity, rather in light of what Tocqueville called the incomplete religions, which will follow one after another. The French Revolution was the first one. The second one is Marxism. Vestiges of this are with us today. And the third one really is identity politics. And he called them incomplete religions because what he understood was that all of them have the category of the innocent victim, but it's not Christianly understood. From Christianity, there's only one innocent victim, and the rest of us are guilty. What all these incomplete religions do is turn this on its side, and they say some groups are innocent victims and the others are guilty. This is the great crisis that we have in our times. And I think the populism piece is important because now everyone has to solve this problem for themselves. And identity politics offers a way of doing this. It gives a whole moral economy that strips away the authority of all the churches, low or high church. And that's the religious movement that we have today. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Josh. Rusty, as you look at this period and sort of reflecting on sort of, your understanding of the Catholic faith and American Christianity, I don't know, what do you make of this period of ferment in the early republic?
Well, I've long thought that the American political culture is essentially Protestants and Catholics are bystanders in all of this, to say nothing of Eastern Orthodox. Maybe you're the servants of the bystanders or something like that. Not very relevant. But it seems to me that mainline Protestantism versus evangelical Christianity is a kind of through line by which to interpret American political culture. And one certainly sees the origins, and one of the great values of this book is it gives a detailed account of the origins of this demotic, populist, evangelical Protestant Christianity has played such an important role in American society and American political culture. Reading this book a dozen years ago was a great preparation for me to face what happened in 2016. And I would strongly, it should be on the required reading list, not just of people studying American religious history, but anyone getting a PhD in American politics. It should be on a list of the 100 books that you absolutely must read if you want to understand American politics. Now, throughout the book, Nathan documents the anti-clerical and anti-elite sentiments that fired the Second Great Awakening. And this had an obvious spiritual dimension, but it also had a political and social dimension that he documents throughout the book. So here's an example of what Massachusetts farmer Amos Singletary said at a meeting. These lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men talk so finely and gloss over matters so finely to make us poor illiterate people swallow down the pill. Now it seems to me that you could substitute liberal elites for clerical elites, and you could pretty much get the same sentiment in the present context. Let me give it a try here. These cosmopolitan elites and corporate oligarchs and the university class talk so finely and gloss over matters so finely to make us poor, left-behind people in the global economy swallow down the bitter pill. I mean, it's really amazing when you go through this book. You can really lift out the quotations of these populist preachers and see the voices of the sort of online right, I think. So for instance, is Tucker Carlson really a kind of latter-day John Leland and Elias Smith? Nathan quoted this establishment pastor very bitter over the rhetoric of Elias Smith, which ran on sneer rather than argument.
Yeah.
And is George Will the contemporary Lyman Beecher, the Litchfield, Connecticut pastor, elite Calvinistic Congregationalist pastor, who really led the effort to corral this new populist religious energy? And is hostility to the swamp really pretty much the contemporary version of hostility to the Calvinistic establishment that really runs like a red thread throughout the Second Great Awakening? Are Trump rallies the camp meetings of the early 1800s? And there's some larger themes, I think, that this book brings out that we can reflect on. Nathan points out that the post-revolutionary context was a time of rapid social change. The revolution had undermined traditional social relations or the authority of traditional institutions. It was a time of atomization. People were moving west, starting over, leaving their communities. It's a crisis of authority. Something seems to be the case here in the post-Cold War era. The economic foundations of middle-class life are severely eroded. We've been through dramatic and rapid cultural change, gay marriage, now transgender. We don't even know what it means to say man and woman. And as well as, as Charles Murray documents in Coming Apart, really the almost complete collapse of institutions in the lower reaches of society. And Hatch emphasizes also that, so it's interesting to think on, there are deep social conditions we can learn and think about why we are in a populist moment politically. And Nathan emphasizes the continuity of populism with the American tradition. It's not, we should not think of our tradition only in terms of elite political theory, but that there was a radical Jeffersonianism that was coursing through the body politic that these religious populists tapped into. And so this is just as much a part of our tradition. The Jacksonianism is just as much a part of our tradition as the Federalist constitutionalism that conservatives are often educated in. And there's also an element here of elite traitors that we can kind of think about. A lot of people think, well, Rusty Reno, you went to Yale. How can you call yourself a political populist? But I think Barton Stone of the Stone Campbell movement was an elite, am I right? He was an elite educated Calvinist minister who lost confidence in this tradition and studied the Bible, and he allied himself and became a leader of a rebellion against the Calvinistic establishment. And I think Nathan also observes that anti-elite religious populism, this is a kind of warning note, give rise to religious demagogues that exert an authority over their followers far greater and more tyrannical than any institutionalized religious leader, because the institution constrains the power of the leader. But an anti-institutional leader, it's what he says. And I think someone like Joseph Smith is a very good example of this. So here's a question. Is Trump a latter-day Joseph Smith? Or is he Lorenzo Dow, the tireless Methodist preacher who was certainly a demotic character, but who expanded Methodism that eventually became itself part of the establishment, a new establishment in America by the 1830s and 40s. Now, it seems to me that the generalized mission of ISI is to train young people to become leaders and members of a new establishment, one that supersedes an increasingly failing liberal establishment. And for that, I think it's very, the mission is all the more important today as we enter into a time of turmoil as to who the American people look to for leadership. Finally, Nathan documents the confidence that these religious populists, the progenitors of evangelical religion in America, the confidence that these populists had that they were fulfilling the sacred mission of America. I mean, the political and the spiritual fuse quite closely here, and it's obviously very much with us today. So I want to end with this question. In 2024, are we witnessing the rise of a post-Christian, irreligious populism that, rather than a renewal of what is described in this book? And if so, the question is, what is it that fulfills America's mission in our time? Josh Mitchell, I think, has some very interesting to say about how actually woke ideology presents itself as the fulfillment of the America's sacred mission. Paradoxically, being anti-American is the fullest, final fulfillment of the true vocation of America. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Johnny.
Yeah, thanks, Rusty, for those remarks. Many questions we can tease out. I want to pose a question to Nathan, and you can also respond to those comments. So, when we think about kind of religious populism today, we see it as sort of a right-wing force, right? The conservatives are the ones that want to both return to the founders and also have this zeal for America and also more of a populist Christianity. But as you go back and you read some of the excerpts from your book, right, again, another quote from the Second Great Awakening period, the passion for equality in these years equaled the passionate rejection of the past. Rather than looking backward and clinging to an old moral economy, insurgent religious leaders espoused convictions that were essentially modern and individualistic. So, if you're hearing that, right, there's not really that much daylight between a statement like that and the wokeness that Josh Mitchell is describing today, just as a general frame of mind. And then also you talk about how these populist religious movements, while they appropriated certainly Jeffersonian rhetoric and Tom Paine's rhetoric, it was in many cases a reaction against the classical republicanism of Adams and Hamilton and many of the other founders. So there's a profound tension there. So I'm curious, we see this religious populism today as a sort of a conservative or right-wing force, but you could also make the case that it was a liberalizing force in the early American Republic. So what is the relationship between this religious populism and either liberalization or conservation?
Well, if there's any one theme in a variety of these groups, it's a kind of Jeffersonian rejection of the past. I mean, Alexander Campbell said, "Open the Bible as if mortal man had never seen it before." That is, we're in a new age, and the past is largely baggage that needs to be discarded. And I think that kind of presentism has characterized a lot of American religion and in some ways American politics. And it's also deeply anti-institutional in that institutions, it's in some ways it is so different from a Roman Catholic view of the world, where you have a tradition, you may disagree, you argue within it, you have a wide variety within an institution, but you don't break off. In America, in the American religious marketplace, I mean, you have thousands of different churches. I mean, people are breaking off every day. And so that kind of anti-institutional thing, and we see that so much today. I mean, I live in North Carolina today, and you probably have read in the last few days, the nominee for governor of North Carolina are the Republicans. It's a man named Mark Robinson. He's come under great scrutiny in the last few days. But he is someone who 5 years ago worked in a factory, not formally educated. I think he went to a Bible college, came to fame at the Greensboro City Council when he gave there was a bill against guns, and he gave this vitriolic speech that went viral. On the basis of that, he became the lieutenant governor of North Carolina and is now it's a kind of raw populism. I mean, the shocking nature of that when you think that typically Republicans, it's the business class that are Republicans in office. And so it's that kind of populism, anti-institutional, that no one ordained him that he could run. The Republican establishment didn't. He just won the primary. And so we see that so rampant today.
I mean, don't you think, part of Trump's appeal in 2016 was that he had all the right enemies. And he had a kind of genius for evoking horror and outrage from elites. And I think that actually won the love of many followers who said, well, that's an obvious sign that he's the right man. All the good people are against him. So I do think this is a very deep part of our American character. It has a political side to it, a don't tread on me kind of side to it, but it's also got this really important religious side to it, this distrust in the clerical institutions. The clerical institutions are an impediment to our relationship with God. You have a lot of Bible churches. We don't have creeds, man-made creeds, because we do nothing at this church but preach the Bible. And that kind of collapsing of time to the moment of encounter with Christ, I have sympathies for. Christianity is Christianity is it's a dialectic of the immediacy of the encounter of faith with the enduring deposit of faith through time.
Josh, what do you make of sort of in our present moment today, kind of the populist energy, the mass appeal, which could either, perhaps, I think it's probably arguably been a liberalizing force historically, but in some sense, right, we're trying to channel the populist energy towards a restoration of the virtues that the founders were trying to conserve, sort of rallying against institutions while also trying to create sort of a new leadership class. How is this, it seems like this is our only course of action, but it seems like a project fraught with great risk. How do you navigate that?
Well, let me start out by saying, when it became clear on the right that there was deep dissatisfaction with the leadership of the Republican Party, that both the Democrats and the Republicans, who could not agree on anything for 50 years, immediately agreed to call this thing populism, made me very nervous. As I said earlier, I think I think populism is the appearance of something that's deeper, and therefore I don't want to look at the epiphenomena as something that's moving. I want to look at the phenomena that gives rise to it. And as I said earlier, I think the phenomena that gives rise to it is captured in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, right there in the Second Great Awakening, 1830s. Namely, increasing delinkage, isolation, and loneliness, the destruction of human authority. And so the preachers were arguing against the past because it was mediated by human authority, but they wanted to get to a direct experience of God. The current day elites, and this is to Rusty's point, it's very strange the elites are somehow involved in this too. The current day liberal elites see God as an obstruction, and the past as an obstruction to getting to a post-God world. So that's the first thing I'll say. Second thing, I've mentioned that populism is a proxy for this deeper psychological experience. Because I tend to view everything through a religious lens, I see populism as a second kind of proxy. And I don't like using this term, but I've used it in print, and I'll use it here. It's the proxy for the distinction between the right kind of white man and the wrong kind of white man. And I think the right kind of white man is Waltz and Biden, and a white man who must, for the sake of his very survival, defend every identity politics proposal there is or be canceled. And the wrong kind of white man is the one who simply cannot exist in the cosmology that identity politics constructs, and that is the white man who does not feel guilt. Now, I'm very nervous about people who do not feel guilt, but I'm saying that Trump and the people who follow him have one thing in common for above and beyond the socioeconomic, because there are a lot of upper class people, so to speak, who support Trump as well, and on the same grounds. They are done with being told that they have irredeemable stain, that they're the wrong kind of white man. And I think there's a deeper religious undertone. And so if you look at it that way, then I think what you have to say is the future lies not in populism, it lies in the understanding that those people have, namely that the manner in which identity politics is trying to address guilt is profoundly destructive for this country. So I prefer to look at it at the deeper psychological level and theological level and say that populism is the proxy for the wrong kind of white man. It's a terrible thing to say, and I will add, the wrong kind of black man. So Bob Woodson, who I have worked with for 5 years, he's the wrong kind of black man. Glenn Lowry, the wrong kind of black man. Shelby Steele, the wrong kind of black man. There's the right kind of this and the wrong kind of this. And that's really what people are fighting about, I think, ultimately, below the level of populism or anti-populism.
Nathan, I'm curious how this has sort of impacted, your experience in your own kind of evangelical community, because I grew up evangelical, and I've seen, it seems like at least many of the more elite evangelicals that I was close with or part of during my formative years have moved more. Maybe they would say they've stayed in the same place, and the Republican Party has gone way in a different direction, but in my vantage point, it appears they've moved more to the left, right? And have perhaps leaned more into identity politics, whereas if you just kind of go out in the heartland, you're just more normal. Maybe evangelical church has sort of gone much more MAGA, right, in their whole approach. So I'm just curious, how do you, did none of I guess my question with the more elite evangelicals is, did none of them read your book and see how this sort of very populist Christianity was sort of part of it, kind of baked into the cake? Or how are you making sense of this in your circles?
Yeah. Well, I've operated in a lot of circles, but I come from an evangelical Protestant background, but I taught many years at the University of Notre Dame. And so I tend to see the sort of the whole panorama of American religion and politics. I mean, I think we live in an extremely confusing time. And I think there is a certain crisis of authority in middle America. It has to do with the rejection of identity politics. It has to do with things like the 1619 Project, which completely overturns what the meaning of America is. It has to do with redefinitions of marriage. It has to do with redefinitions of gender. If you go into an average town in North Carolina and what people believe and what they value, they see that fundamentally challenged, and they're going to react against it in, if not populist ways, in vernacular ways. And they're going to have great appeal for someone who takes that on. So I do think, a lot of conservative elites, a lot of evangelical elites are caught. The publisher of the Washington Post told me I had a daughter at Wake Forest, told me a few years ago, we keep hiring conservative columnists, but no one will support Trump. That is, I think, someone like George Will, or David Brooks, or a whole raft of people. I think the current political moment makes it hard for thoughtful elites, political or religious, because I think many of us don't know exactly where to find a political home. And the Pope said recently, you can't support either candidate. And I think that's where a lot of thoughtful, believing people are.
So one quick rapid fire question, and then we'll move to audience questions. So a friend of ours, Aaron Wren, who you might be familiar with, has this thesis that Christianity, we've essentially in America has moved from a positive world where being a Christian was sort of a net asset to a neutral world. And then at some point around maybe 2014, 2015, the neutral world shifted to a negative world where being a Christian was sort of a net negative in terms of being a productive, accomplished member of society. So as we operate in that negative world, and as we kind of engage in politics, do you have any sort of brief advice for how Christians or people of religious faith generally should think about engaging in this political moment we find ourselves in? Josh?
I think Aaron is right on, but I would put it in slightly different terms, not so much positive, negative, but we're involved in a titanic struggle in Western civilization. Heretofore, heresies within Christianity have been rejected, and I fear that we are at a moment where the identity politics heresy will not be rejected, and I'll say it again, because the central insight of Christianity, namely that there is an innocent victim who's divine, who is the one sufficient scapegoat who takes away the sins of the world, has become an embarrassment. Paul said that. Conservatives are prepared to talk about Christian values and Christian principles, but they're not prepared to talk about the cross. And my view is that unless, that is the only antidote to this poison, and by that I simply mean that unless we remind our identity politics heretic friends and family members that what they're doing is feasting on crumbs, that in fact they are looking in the right, they are asking the right question, how can stain be removed? But they're doing it in a deeply destructive way. The way they think we can do it is by removing all evidence of the history of mankind, which is why this must move to transhumanism. The stain of the Civil War, colonialism, the Holocaust, 2 world wars. The only way to get rid of this, they think, is to erase the whole of history, not to look to Christ. And I'm saying to them, and I'm saying to us, that I'll say it as strongly as I can, it is the embarrassment of the cross that alone has been able to answer the heretics across history, and until that gets returned to, this identity politics will run roughshod over all of us.
Nathan.
I'm a little more bullish on colleges and universities today, because I see people of faith in there. People today are deeply lonely. All faculty of whatever political persuasion do not like dysfunctional institutions. And it's a tremendous opportunity for people to reach out to their colleagues, to be a leaven of understanding, of love, of cooperation. I see someone like Abram Van Engen, who is chair of the English department at Washington University, a very devout, a wonderful scholar. He's in a department that's very far to the left. He's not there, but by goodwill, the kind of influence he's able to have. So I see the university not as a place to give up on, but a place of opportunity for people to operate in.
My sense is that it is a negative world. And it's not just a negative world for people of faith. It's a negative world for everyone, almost everyone. It's really hard to be 21 years old in America 2024. If your mother didn't get a college degree, you're likely to have grown up in a household without a father. And if you're from some elite family in Upper East Side of Manhattan, you're likely taking medication for your mental health problems as you've barely survived this terrible gauntlet of careerism to get into some fancy pants university. It's bad out there. And the Bible it's a crisis. And the biblical, that's just the Greek, krizos, judgment, decision. People are realizing that they've got to actually make a decision. And it's a fertile time for evangelization, actually. I'm not saying we're heading into a third great awakening, but the winds of change are definitely blowing in our society. Some people go farther to the left, but a lot of people are going to the right, even farther to the right, often to the dismay of their elders. And I think that Christianity is going to play an indispensable role in preserving, in keeping the American right humane, sane, charitable, and a productive part of, we have to run our country because the liberal elite is failing. And so we're going to need to have the wherewithal to be clear in our convictions, but also capable of running a country with people who don't share our convictions. And I think we can do it.
All right, let's move to audience questions. We have about 10 minutes. We've got one right here in the front. Tom, if you can bring the mic over. Please keep your questions short and in the form of a question.
Yeah, so the question I want to ask is, do you see populism as any sort of solution, and why?
Is populism a solution, and why?
I mean, populism is primarily no. It's primarily a no. And as George Will correctly said, real political achievement rests upon a yes. What is it, not just that we're opposed to, but what do we affirm? Now, when I first got started at First Things a dozen years ago, I would come to the office and I would ask my staff, okay, I know what I'm against. Remind me, what am I for? And I think the populism is primarily a hammer blow against a dysfunctional and indifferent elite. I could also say that populism in religion, and Nathan's book, I think, documents that, and in politics, it really doesn't have the capacity to govern, because governance requires leadership and command of institutions. And anti-institutionalism is fitting sometimes when institutions are legitimately untrustworthy, but it just doesn't have the ability to organize civic life in a lasting way. And I'll conclude by saying that New Yorker magazine, I think a day or two ago, had a piece about Opus Dei's takeover of the American right wing in Washington, D.C. And it reflects a certain kind of paranoia, to be sure, but it is the case that as this evangelical Protestant-inspired populist impulse takes hold, that Catholicism may wind up playing an outsized role in shaping the sensibilities of right-wing elites who have to actually take command and rebuild the institutions of our country. So there's some element of truth in that kind of hysterical New York Magazine article.
Next question.
So Aaron Wrenn recently
Real quick, if you could just say your name and what your university is.
David Evans Martinez, the University of Alabama. Aaron Wrenn recently wrote a piece touching on the conversion of the GOP VP nominee to Catholicism and the religion of right-wing elites. So it's convenient that you mentioned the Opus Dei thing. In contrast with the religion of the common American, that there being an intellectual tradition and openness to scientific discoveries among the ancient high church communities and a stigma, a sometimes low-class stigma associated with others. That there is a divide, a growing divide, between leaders and rank-and-file right-wingers in terms of religion. Is this real? And if so, what might come of this divergence?
So maybe this is sort of the divergence between MAGA on one hand and the new right on the other, which is sort of the more intellectual champions of that program. Any thoughts?
It's interesting that many of the Catholic leaders in the political sphere are Protestant converts to Catholicism. I mean, J.D. Vance certainly has no difficulty connecting culturally with the evangelical or post-evangelical. As we know, evangelical often refers to people who identify with that tradition but don't actually go to church. He doesn't have any problem identifying with that, but nonetheless he can draw upon Catholicism's very rich tradition of social teaching to orient on how to actually function and lead institutions.
Josh.
Let me just say something here, and I say this as somebody who's on my father's side, family goes back to the Middle East a long way, Antioch Orthodox Church. And it was well known within the Christian community there, and my family left in 1890, my father's family, that if the predominant religion doesn't get its act together, the minority religion isn't going to be able to fix things. And that lesson for me in America is as important. I agree with Rusty very much. As important is as the Catholic contribution will be at the higher level. This is ultimately a Protestant problem, and it's not going to be solved unless Protestants get their act together.
Chuck Colson used to say about in this evangelical Catholic dialogue that first things started 20-some years ago, you supply the ideas, we supply the votes.
All right, we've got another question over here. Also, please speak loudly into the microphone so we can hear you.
Leo Kerner from Harvard. There's this book, Dawn of All, which plays with the idea that the whole world has, or most of it has converted to Catholicism. If the US, let's say in 100 years, were to do that as a hypothetical, how would this sort of populist makeup of America, these sort of evangelical sects, how would it change the structure of American politics?
So yeah, I think the question is, if America were to become entirely Catholic, what would happen, if anything, to populism?
From your lips to God's ears.
I guess Rusty's the only one who can answer this.
I don't know about that.
I mean, I can.
Yeah, go for it, Nathan. Yeah.
I mean, America's not becoming only Catholic, but I agree with Rusty. The Catholic intellectual tradition is so deep and strong and capacious that I think it will offer a lot of ways out for a lot of people, including Protestants. But the U.S. is not going to turn completely Catholic. I mean, as immigration continues to happen.
Well, even there, I mean, it could be that Brazil's an entirely Protestant country in 100 years.
Yeah.
So a lot of the immigrants from the south of the border don't come to us as Catholics. They come to us as Pentecostal Protestants.
Right. And once again, it's that kind of vernacular religion on the level where people are, that is so compelling.
It's a genius of, I think, this kind of Christianity that you document in the Second Great Awakening has done more to Americanize the globe than any other force. I mean, Africa, Asia, India, not so much India, they're very hostile about evangelization, and South America. Historians may write about the 21st century as that Americanization was carried by Pentecostal missionaries to the four corners of the earth.
More questions?
Hello, my name is Thomas Ahn. I'm from Swarthmore College. I have a question for both Dr. Hatch and Dr. Mitchell. There are a few American thinkers who have traced recent ideological developments back to, and by recent I mean you can go back 100 years, but back to Protestantism. For Murray Rothbard, in his book The Progressive Era, talks about, he says the post-millennial Yankee pietists were the ones who laid the groundwork for the progressive movement. And Paul Gottfried, in his book Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt, says that it is the Calvinist understanding of original sin that underlies the notion of white guilt, that underlies the notion that men owe something to women because they've oppressed women over the years. And you see these de-theologized Christian concepts appear all throughout these modern, basically contemporary leftist ideologies, or perhaps you could even speak of one ideology. And Dr. Mitchell said that basically these kind of woke, radical leftists are they're picking up the crumbs of Christianity. But my concern, and I think this is a concern for a broader concern for Christians, is that there are many thinkers now on the right, for example, the French New Right, who criticize Christianity as such, because they say the notion of the universal subject, the notion of a universal history, all of these notions ultimately gave rise to liberalism, Marxism, which is a derivative of liberalism, and now what we might call cultural Marxism, what Gottfried has called cultural Marxism. So it seems to me that if Christians want to have a good response to all of these developments, they have to be willing to reconceptualize, so to speak, the concept of the person, the notion of universal history. How do we as Christians, for example, emphasize particularity while holding on to St. Paul's teaching that regardless of whether you're a Gentile or a Jew, so long as you believe in Christ, you're saved, right? So these de-theologized Christian concepts appear all throughout modern ideologies, and it seems to me that Christians don't have an adequate response because they're basically criticizing, and if you hold to the view that Christianity has a kind of inner logic that gave rise to all of these leftist ideas, then you need to hear an adequate response to that. You as a Christian need to be able to respond that the concept of the person is absolutely central, that universal history is central, and that these are perennial notions, irrespective of nation, whatever, class. So how do we as Christians respond to these criticisms? And do you think there is a need to reconceptualize the very basic concepts of Christianity to respond to all of these developments?
I'm generally...
This will be our last question, so let's just take it in order and wrap in your closing thoughts.
Yeah. It's a great question. The reason I started the way I did by recognizing the social sciences and 300 years of speculation starting from Rousseau rejected the Christian distinction between pre and post and gave us whole new histories was something clearly was amiss. And I don't think the path back to Christendom is an easy one. I think it literally has to pass through and undo Rousseau, Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger. That is no easy task. But having said that, the evidence around us is that I don't think Christianity gave rise to it. I think the human condition is not by nature disposed to Christianity, which is why there is grace. And in the condition of ill disposition toward it, it looks for other shortcuts. And the incomplete religions that Tocqueville talks about, the one, French Revolution, then led to Marxism and now leads to identity politics. So I don't think it's the case that Christianity gives rise to these things. This is a terrible error. It is promulgated by people who want to move into a post-liberal age. This is a catastrophe, people. The people on the right who are moving into the either a post-liberal age or want to return to a kind of pre-modern integralism, precisely at the time where identity politics is going to blow it all up, we've got huge fissures on the right. And my view is, no, it's the Constitution and that clearly requires some deep theological commitment, and I'm fully prepared to say that includes the full range of historically understood Christendom, but we cannot move in this direction. The alt-right, I'll be very quick on this one, the alt-right correctly understands that imputing guilt which cannot be lifted is a terrible way to live. And we have a lot of young people on the alt-right, some who are in this room, who are saying, we're done with guilt. And that impulse is right, but where that goes, you need to know. Go read Nietzsche. It goes to the return to aristocratic cruelty, and I'm not willing to abide by that. We have to be able to put guilt back in the Christian context so that we can have it tomorrow through atonement, forgiveness, and repentance. And unless we do that, we're going to have we're going to have centuries of this identity politics stuff flanked by an alt-right that wants to destroy guilt altogether. It's a really ugly century that we're looking forward to unless we can recover. And your challenge is a really important one. There's a reason why Rousseau, Marx, and Hegel, German idealism, they went in a direction because there was a failure there, and we have to own up to it, and it's a long road.
Clearly, Christianity is the font of the West, and it's Christianity. It's its appropriation of the ancients, and it has always given birth to perversions. Whether it's antinomianism or millennialism of various sorts, and Eric Voegelin's account of the immunization of the eschaton is a very convincing account of how the politics of the West has been perverted by the usurpation of God's role as the agent of consummation for us to usurp it and assume that we have a redemptive politics, that politics have to be redemptive. It's a great temptation, and it's especially a temptation in the United States in our new order for the ages. And so I think part of it is to recover a politics that's more modest, to Augustinian, that we should seek to restore the tranquility of order, so that we can live together in peace and cultivate our gardens in our private lives rather than seeking a redemptive politics. And I think we can do that. I think it was George Will said that people are not so much angry as exhausted. And I think there's a lot to that. There's a lot of exhaustion. People would like to stop the hysteria, have a well-ordered society, and be free to raise their kids and take a vacation.
Last word.
If there's one distinction between these movements of the early Republic and today, it is that, any movement is political, but they were pretty apolitical, and they were interested in building religious movements, not so much engagement in politics. And so if I leave one concern, it's something that Robert Wuthnow said a number of years ago, sociology at Princeton. And he says in the modern world, in the last 30 years, it is political convictions that are overwhelming religious convictions. And so that's on the left and I think on the right. Mm-hmm. And I think as young people, you have to be careful to say, what are religious convictions that come out of the church, that come out of Scripture, that override any political ideology to the left and the right? Because I see Protestantism today too much being controlled by politics on the left, where identity politics becomes a new form of religion, or sometimes on the right. And I think one has to return to the wells of what the church teaches, and that is the kingdom to which we need to be aligned.
Hear, hear.
Fantastic.